Okay, year 11s, we're going to be looking at the carbon cycle, and particularly we're going to be trying to examine that link between the carbon cycle and microbes, particularly these decomposers that we've talked about very briefly in our previous video. So the first thing is, where do we actually get our source of carbon from? What's the very beginning of this carbon cycle? The diagram shows it very clearly. It's in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what's interesting is that the actual source of carbon for everything else are plants. Animals get their carbon from plants. And so once the animals get their carbon from these plants, they actually take that in, if they're a herbivore, directly from the plants, or if they're a carnivore, from another animal. And those organisms then release that carbon dioxide as CO2 through the process of respiration. But not all of their carbon gets released into the atmosphere. And if this weren't the case, if all of the carbon left in dead bodies was just left in the soil, then we would have run out of carbon dioxide a long, long time ago. So we have this additional step here where we have these decomposers, or the slide calls them detritivores. So it's just because they decompose detritus. So a carnivore eats meat, a herbivore eats plants, a detritivore eats detritus. It's very simple. The detritus is just the decaying bodies, the dead bodies of these once living organisms, plants as well as animals. And so detritivores undergo further respiration to release that energy so that we get as much carbon out of these organisms and into their atmosphere as we possibly can. But obviously there's this disconnect here. There's this link where we don't actually have all of the carbon stored in our bodies released back into the atmosphere. And we know that because we have these things called fossil fuels, which are basically just great big batteries of stored carbon dioxide. So we have this big unusual behavior here. What we're going to do is just quickly go through that and how that links in very quickly using a diagram. You're going to need to be able to interpret diagrams. So we're going to spend some time doing that now. So we start with our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then it needs to enter plants. I haven't written the process that does this. If you don't know it, go back to previous videos or go back to previous slides and look it up. It happens in plants, happens in plant organelles. Animals then take the carbon from their diet. I'm just going to draw in red, respiration returning it. Obviously we've got a step that we're missing here though. This exact same process. It's still just respiration. Now, the bit that's missing so far, or the bit that's missing still. Some carbon doesn't get broken down by detritivores. Some carbon stays in the soil, and that will be converted into fossil fuels. These fossil fuels will then be burnt by humans eventually, so that we re-release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So we burn it for energy. This is our process. This is what we're looking at. What we're most interested in, because we're looking specifically at microorganisms, are the detritivores. These microorganisms, fungi, bacteria in soil or in the ocean, in some cases for bacteria that will sometimes be able to do this, where they're breaking down this carbon stored in bodies, whether it's as glucose or whether it's as proteins or however else it's found. And they release this back into the atmosphere. Where humans interfere with it is by burning them as fossil fuels. Now, there isn't going to be a lot of analysis around that. You're going to need to be able to basically reproduce a diagram something like this, or interpret a diagram something like this, and indicate what it is that the organisms, the microorganisms, these detritivores are able to do. That's going to be your primary thing.